Hey folks, this is Abel James, and thanks so much for joining us on the show. What does the concept of longevity mean to you? Does it mean pumping your body full of exogenous hormones, peptides, stem cells, brain implants, and gradually replacing your organs with lab-grown pig parts? Perhaps some of us will sign up to be a brain in a jar. Or can we cruise into our second century by living a simple life of self-reflection, meditating deep in the mountains? After all, in remote corners of the world, there are legends of yogis and spiritual masters living so long that their true age is forgotten to time. Indeed, there are many paths on the road to a long life. In the years ahead, the bifurcation between devout transhumanists on a quest to live forever and those who prefer a more natural approach to aging will become more and more obvious. Today, I'm honored to be joined by our friend Mark Divine, a former Navy SEAL commander, entrepreneur, and renowned expert in personal transformation, mindfulness, and the untapped potential of the human mind. In this expansive conversation, we explore the transformative power of silence and self-reflection, the intricate dance between the ego and attachment, as well as extraordinary feats of consciousness, healing, and longevity documented in Eastern spiritual traditions. In this episode, you'll discover how to break free from the conditioning and limiting beliefs that lead many of us to a common life of quiet desperation, powerful practices to master the mind's energy by combining Eastern wisdom and Western science, why sitting in silence and witnessing one's thoughts is crucial for deconstructing limiting beliefs and stories, leading to greater freedom and self-awareness, how to redefine your relationship with reality to unlock your full potential, and much more. Let's go hang out with Mark. Welcome back, folks. Returning to the show today is the one and only Mark Divine, a former Navy SEAL commander, entrepreneur, father, and New York Times bestselling author of many books, including Staring Down the Wolf, The Way of the SEAL, Unbeatable Mind, as well as his latest book entitled Uncommon. Welcome back to the show, Mark.
Abel, thanks so much for having me here, man. It's great to see you again.
Great to see you too. So, as I understand, especially reading through this book, but also being a little bit familiar with your background, you used to be common yourself. Tell us about that.
You know what's funny? Everybody is common until they decide to change the nature of that story, right? So yeah. I like to look at it as kind of, like Mark 1.0 was conditioned to be a certain way. And this is true of all human beings. Like you pop out of the womb and all of a sudden the conditioning starts, the training starts. But you don't have the awareness to be in charge of that training plan and that training program. So that training program is led by others, some who care for you really deeply, like your parents, we should hope. Others who really need you to kind of fit a certain, mold for culture, for society, etc. So the training it's multidimensional. And it's irresistible because you're baked into the system. So that leads to, what you would call common results, right? You are literally high stepping to the beat. And so many people never leave that because they don't take the time to investigate. They don't begin the work of self-awareness. And I'm very fortunate that, I was kind of drawn to that inward path in my early 20s, which led to a complete, almost a breakdown, but it was really more of a breakthrough to see that all that conditioning that led to the common path that would have led to a life of quiet desperation, because it was already experienced that way, right? Doing, heading down a path, pell-mell that would have really been, quite like spiritually disastrous for me. Chasing the money and chasing the corporate greed and climbing the corporate ladder. So that's what I mean by being common. And I was that. And I was also common in that I was really in the victim mentality, stuck in a rut with all the emotional patterns and lack of awareness about how childhood trauma had affected me and was causing less than optimal results in relationships, as well as other, things. So I think that the kind of the core message that I wanted to bring out in the book is for people who feel like they're stuck in that rut and they want to be uncommon. I'm reminded one of the like most profound memories I had that really kind of woke me up that it's possible to, really completely transform yourself is when I started to go down the path of, I'd been, meditating now for about a year and a half in my 20s. So I was about 21 and I started to get this experience while I was meditating. And I talk about this in my book, The Way of the Seal, that I was meant to be a warrior. And while I was kind of sitting with that, like if I'm meant to be a warrior, but I'm here working in New York as a CPA, what is up with that? I stumbled across a Navy recruiting office and I saw this poster. And the poster had a bunch of Navy SEALs doing stuff. It said nothing about the Navy SEALs, but it said, be someone special across the top. And I'm like, well, that's uncommon. I would like to be someone special, but I certainly don't feel that way now. And if it's possible, and if there's a group or organization or a path that can lead me there, then I'm all in. And so Uncommon, the book, is a path that can lead individuals, if they're ready for that, to do that work, out of the rut of being common, out of the rut of being conditioned by parents and society and, schooling and church and everything, into these, a set of beliefs and patterns that are really not allowing them to tap their full potential by any stretch of the imagination. And so it's a path to get there. And we don't have that in our Western culture, right? That unless you've been a deep participant in a martial art or maybe even Eastern spiritual tradition, like it's just not even in the lexicon. Like even Western psychotherapy doesn't talk about a path of evolution, where you're going to be, entertaining and accessing more and more transcendent states and stages of experience, of consciousness, of awareness. Western psychotherapy and Western personal development is really more about habituation, cognitive behavioral therapy, changing this, changing that, and also shadow work, which is really working on past stuff, which can be helpful. I'm not disdaining that, but it's important that we bring the Eastern kind of wisdom and marry it with Western, scientific grounding, and have a true path laid out for especially young professionals, younger people these days, so they understand that there is a way to really, tap into your unlimited potential, to perform at your peak at all times, and not, only when you're gunning for that, that sporting event, right? But it's your life to uncover your purpose, right? The reason that you're on this planet, and to align with that, and to live it. And also to develop the capacity to love all human beings, to deeply connect, to be so radically inclusive that everybody is included, everything, including Mother Earth, is included in your circle of care and concern, while you greatly appreciate the diversity, right? And those are the benefits of really kind of embarking on a path like that. And that's uncommon. You see what's going on in our world today that we talked about briefly before. It's a really violent and fear-ridden world. And that's because it serves the powers that be to keep people in fear, because they're easily controlled and managed.
And it's worth acknowledging, you mentioned conditioning. A lot of us learn to be, myself included, hoop jumpers, right? And this conditioning is very much designed, as you say, to keep you limited and dependent. And so it's not necessarily our fault necessarily, but we do need to take responsibility for it at some point. So what's one way to acknowledge that this has kind of entered your life, or that you do have some of that conditioning? And then how do you unwind that a bit?
Well, for me, and I believe this is the way, what I teach, right? And I think, people listening to podcasts like this, it can be very helpful. When I was in my 20s, I didn't have podcasts. I did have some books. Access to information like this was hard to find. which I consider to be a great benefit to me at the time, because also part of the conditioning of the Western mind is to always be grasping outside of yourself for something new, something shiny, right? And so the personal development, you call it hoop jumping, personal development realm, you see people just literally chasing the shiny ball round and round in circles, right? They download the content in one program. They're like, okay, I got it, check. What's next? And then chase the next program, then the next program, the next program. And they never actually slow down and stop long enough to actually do the practices to a level where they start to take root. And so I found through Zen meditation when I was 21, that story we talked about years ago on a podcast where I met a Zen master masquerading as a martial arts instructor,
as they
Tadashi
do, yeah.
Nakamura, as they do, the good ones. And so I was one of a few. He had hundreds and hundreds of students in New York, hundreds of thousands globally. And in his Zen class, there were 10 of us. And 9 black belts and me as a white belt, because I was like, this is really interesting. And I think because of my upbringing and spending a lot of time in nature, I was comfortable sitting in silence. And so it was the process of literally just stopping first once a week for an hour. And then I started doing it every day, just stopping everything, stopping the world and just sitting there and turning within. That created a profound separation of this sense of self as the thinker to the sense of self as the witness of the thinker. And when that happened, I was able to start to see the thoughts in these patterns, right? And the patterns kept repeating and repeating and repeating. And then I was able to trace those patterns to see where they, how they came about. And so by sitting in silence, I was able to see the story that I was living and then able to deconstruct it. And in that deconstruction, I started to see that, wow, that story is not, A, it's not my story. And B, it's not a positive story. It's not going to lead me to what I perceive that I really want, which is freedom and peace of mind and happiness, right? That story is going to lead to more drama, more complexity, more separation, probably more fear even. And you see this, people who don't investigate their stories, that's the experience they have. The longer they stay stuck in the limited, contracted story that they have to constantly be, hitting the next hoop, putting more money in the bank, chasing the next car, chasing the next girl, chasing the next rung on the ladder, eventually they burn out, or they get into that nihilistic, phase of like, nothing matters. This is all bullshit, because they're not experiencing what they're meant to experience in life, which is that peace. Now you can have both. That's the beautiful thing. That's uncommon, right? You can have all of that material success, all that stuff, but uncommon is to not be attached to it, not be confused about what's real and what's kind of the fantasy, the playground, So the silence, I think, for everybody is crucial. Again, one more contrast, right? Like, there's a reason that it's so hard to do that, because distractions and the speed and the pace of change and the social media and the pull to keep us away from taking time to just sit and be with ourselves and allow that kind of settling of the mind, the separation of, witnesser from thinker, to be able to like really, really sit with that and see that those stories that have been conditioned into you aren't your stories and aren't necessary. Well, if everybody did that, suddenly the entire economy would collapse, because everybody would be like, why am I running around spending countless dollars that I don't have on things that I don't need and going into debt? And you just completely deconstruct all those stories. You're like, I don't need any of that stuff. So the corporate machine, and even the political machine, and those things are married at the hip these days, works overtime to keep people distracted and away from their true selves. So I think those of us who grew up in the pre-internet era had a great kind of leg up. At the same time, we didn't have all the content and podcasts. So it's like, it's a balancing act. So what we have today is conversations like this, which can really open people's minds very quickly. You don't have to spend 9 months to come to the same conclusion, that like it took me. Having said that, you still must take the information and sit with it, right? There's one of my favorite quotes. A guy named Punjab, an Indian guy, said, "Sitting in silence is the most important thing to do. Don't waste time not doing it." Of course, now sitting in silence, Abel, as you know, like, okay, so how do we do that? And that's where I take you through in the whole book on common. Like, it sounds simple, sitting in silence, but there are absolutely a lot of things that have to happen as prerequisites, right? As you know, like physical health is critical. It's very difficult to do the work of mental development and emotional awareness and intuitive expansion and connecting with your spirit if your body is unhealthy, out of shape, dysregulated, diseased. That's why in the book, I break it into the 5 mountains, which are the 5 training domains: physical, mental, emotional, intuitional, and spiritual. And the physical is first. It's the foundation, right? So you get the foundation healthy, and then that means your brain is going to be healthy. And if your brain is healthy, then you're going to be able to perceive, the mind more clearly, and you're going to be able to work with it more effectively, right? So that's really the beginning of the path. It's not unlike, in the martial arts tradition, like you first work on the physical movements and the physical conditioning of the body. You're not getting into energy work or the more advanced breath practices or, the sitting in silence until that white belt is, now a green belt or a brown belt, and they've conditioned their mind. In fact, the black belt, the first degree, was considered the start of your journey. Everything else was preparatory. So the physical mountain development, getting yourself healthy through exercise, learning how to move effectively, right? With awareness, that somatic movement practices are so valuable. Dialing in your nutrition and your domain, your nutrition and your, the way you orient yourself with food, right? So that it's support as opposed to a limiting thing. Getting out and spending more time in nature, developing a community of positive people who you can work on these things together with, using breath practices and other mechanisms to eliminate stress or to balance all the stress on your life. These are all the things that are, they're not new, but they need to be taken seriously as a prerequisite to doing the deeper introspective work, right?
Well, it's fascinating because you've obviously been working in this domain as well as online and educating people for a long time. I've been doing this podcast and kind of living in that online world for a long time as well. And it is fascinating to see how many things are kind of repeated now. Like, a lot of people are saying the same things, but I find that not so many people might be doing them, like sitting in silence or actually exercising. It's easier to consume a bunch of YouTube videos or listen to podcasts about what the perfect exercise might be or whether or not beans are bad for you than it is to actually just sit there. And at the same time, so most of us are overstimulated, even if we are somewhat conscious of it. And so there is this temptation, as you mentioned in your book, to numb that feeling through substances or through kind of addictive behaviors. And I know that's part of your background as well, where you were kind of like trying to numb away your past by going out and drinking beer. And I mean, we all do this sometimes, and most of the time it's not a conscious decision. It's just kind of going with whatever flow, whatever habits we're into. So maybe you can talk about that. How do you notice that that's happening, and how do you start to correct that over time?
Yeah. Well, it's pretty normal, right? So it's the cycle of like desire for pleasure and desire to move away from discomfort or its more extreme level pain. And so human beings are swinging, some swinging subtly between, desire and fear and happiness, or some swinging wildly. And the wild swings are addictive patterns. The other swings, you can still have addictive patterns, but maybe they don't have the destructiveness of, the wild swings. So depending upon your upbringing, depending upon, kind of the energy that you bring into this life, you call that karma in the East, you're going to have something, right, that is going to lead you to some sort of pattern that we could call addiction, right? Or some sort of pattern that maybe is suboptimal. For me, it was alcohol in my family because practically 10 generations that I'm aware of on both sides. So that's kind of like stuck in my genes or my at a cellular level. And then I, of course, grew up with it in my household. So what balanced that out for me was, my athleticism, right? The discipline. And so I would train, I was classic. I was actually built for the SEALs because I trained really hard and then I played really hard. But the playing really hard included alcohol.
Sure.
And so that doesn't work so well, or it can work okay for a little while, but over time it doesn't work well because it leads to kind of that binge, that boom and bust of the binger. So I had to recognize that. And, first getting slapped down a couple times, but then saying, that's not going to work anymore. Now, it is the self-aware person, kind of like the phase 2 person, who can then tackle that. This is why people go in and out of rehab and they never really fix it, because the phase 1 person is stuck in the patterns and stuck in the belief that they are who they are. In other words, they haven't tapped into their growth mindset, right? They're fixed. And they haven't examined that story. And so they're unwilling to look at it. They said, this is just who I am. I'm hoping that this fixes me, but if it doesn't fix me, I am who I am. And they go right back into that pattern because it's so deeply grooved into the psyche. So here's the thing, like, you don't just carve out a pattern like that and jettison it easily, right? Even when, descriptions of people who have enlightenment experience, who attain awakened awareness, let's call it that, patterns still continue. It's just that, the individual recognizes that there's no doer behind those patterns. It's just the body, mind instrument kind of like continuing to do what it's always done. And that individual just watches it and doesn't buy into it. And so because the individual doesn't energize that pattern, slowly it loses its power and often just disappears. So I found that to be extremely helpful because essentially we can use that as a practice and say, okay, I've got this pattern. Don't try to do I'm going to fight this pattern, because anything that you fight, you're giving energy to, right? You're energizing it. It's like the fear wolf and courage wolf metaphor, right? Which wolf wins? Well, it's the one you feed the most. So if you're feeding that negative and fear-based addictive pattern by fighting it, obsessing over it, you're just energizing it, and it's going to get even more deeply rooted. So the way to work is to stop feeding it and to feed something courageous, right? Something heartfelt, something positive in its place. So, when it comes to alcohol, you look for things that are positive to do at the times that you normally drink. Or if there's people that you hang out with who, draw you into the bottle, or, always, everything you do with them involves alcohol, well, you find people that do other things that are healthier and then go hang out with them. Right? So there's a little bit of behavior modification that works, but also it's with awareness, you can now look at, this is like where the mindfulness comes in, right? If you're working on the process of moving towards silence, ultimately it'll lead you to this mindfulness where you become aware of the patterns as they arise. And you practice something that the Dzogchen tradition calls catching the snake at the head instead of the tail. So with awareness, with mindfulness, you're starting to feel the desire for the drink, and you just watch that, you feel into it, you just don't take any action because you've caught that feeling at the head, and you just sit with it. You maybe have a glass of water. And then eventually that feeling, you'll notice that it subsides. You're like, oh, I don't feel like it anymore. Or I feel less. Good, right? And if you do that and then have a drink, you've made progress, because now the next time you can do it for longer and longer. Whereas, catching the snake at the tail would be like the feeling for a drink comes up, you grab a drink, then another, and then you're on your third, and you're like, damn, I wasn't going to drink tonight.
Yeah.
Right? But the snake is whipping around, biting you all over the place. So this is the both and practice. Pretty much everyone can apply to a lot of different practices. You have the outer kind of Western model of let me do something to fix this. And then you have the Eastern model of like, everything is fine. It's just that body-mind has conditioned some of those patterns. So I need to stop feeding those patterns with mindfulness, de-energize them, and just rest in my natural state. And my natural state is peace and happiness and equanimity. I think this is one of the profound things that I've uncovered, is that they're both those approaches are valuable, but without each other, they're incomplete. It's the yin and the yang, right? The yang outward energy is the Western model, and the yin kind of inward, I'm okay energy is the Eastern model. So they work together like hand and glove. And, this is a big issue, dealing with these patterns and addictions and overcoming those, because those are a huge obstacle for development, for spiritual advancement, for, evolution. And we've got to kind of knock down those big obstacles, right, in order to go further. Right. So if that's an issue in your life, then start there. That's your practice.
What if it's not quite so obvious as something like alcohol or pharmaceuticals or drugs, and it's more like an addiction to running or exercising or overperformance or overachieving and that sort of thing? How do you untangle that?
Well, it's a little bit harder because, like you said, we've been trained to think that that is good. And like everything in moderation, including moderation, right? There's nothing wrong with winning an event, but if your sole purpose is winning all the time, or competition, or beating others, then you set yourself up for an impossible life, right? It's going to be a endless series of frustration trying to prop up that false belief, that you need to win or be better than someone else, because you're not, right? You may have certain skills that others don't, and you may have a certain combination of skills and energy to be able to win an event here and there. And you may be able to prop that up for a while. But when you're done with that, then what? Right? Then what? Who are you? And so, generally speaking, those patterns, that pattern in particular, it arises from an over-identification with the body and its ability to perform a certain feat. And so you take your identity from that. And so the antidote is the same as with an addiction, because essentially what we're saying is you're addicted to your body. We saw this a lot in CrossFit, right? Oh my gosh.
Sure.
Yeah, it's a lot of fitness and body addiction going on, body identification. And again, it works for a little while, and it's okay to get healthy, but to over-identify with the body is going to be, it's another trap. It's another obstacle to further development. And so to recognize that, again, what do you really want in life? right? Do you want to always be trying to, like Sisyphus, push the rock up the hill to be the best of the best of the best? And I have podcasts just like you do of people who just can't stop trying to prove how tough they are. And I remember asking some of them, like, what are you running from? Right? And it always is related to some sort of childhood trauma where they just never felt whole or worthy or loved even as a child. And so they're constantly trying to prove themselves in the outer world. So self-awareness, the same practice of just sitting and beginning to watch the thoughts, separate from the thoughts, and you watch the thoughts and you start to see, wow, I am playing out that pattern. And just keep doing that and just watch. You don't have to fix anything, but just start to disengage the energy and to be more comfortable in the being as opposed to doing space, which can only be found in silence until you can embody that and bring that silent presence into your actions. That's what the term wei wu wei means. Action without the actor being the ego. And the Zen process of taming the ego, right, is the same thing. So it's the ego that needs to put points on the board. It's the ego that needs to win. It's the ego that is the perfectionist. And the ego is all based on fear, because what the fear is fear of not being enough, fear of not being seen, right? So it's no different than the influencer having to have more likes and followers than other people. And if they don't, they feel less than. It's that ego that just fears not being enough, not being seen, not being loved, not being worthy. And so when you sit in silence and you start to examine that, you realize that's all a bullshit story. But it's pretty conditioned deeply, and it's got roots in childhood trauma. And if you find me a human, Abel, that doesn't have some sort of trauma pattern, if you go to that convention, there'll be half a person there. There'll be one person maybe.
Right.
Because it's not, right? The human experience is about stepping into the battleground and working like Arjuna from the Bhagavad Gita, working through your shit, not avoiding it. Avoid it, you're just going to accrue more negative karma. So you see, when you sit in silence and you watch those patterns, and you see that it's the ego that needed to be perfect and needed to put points on the board, and you begin to see the futility of it. And simultaneously, you're opening up to the experience that, man, every time I sit in silence, I come out of it feeling like everything's okay. And you become less attached to those things. And so this is an iterative process. You watch it. It has an effect on your attachment to the neediness to be that perfect person. And so it begins to decharge that. You feel less interest in it. And of course, there's a long tail of commitments you've made and things you plans. And so you just play those out, but then you stop engaging in more, right? You stop putting energy into the system. You stop saying yes to all those competitions, and yes to climbing the 7 summits, and yes to the next marathon, triple marathon in 3 different different continents, or keeps whatever going. It is for you. It just keeps going. It never ended, right? You just look at that and say, yeah, no, I've had my day. I don't have nothing to prove. And then suddenly what you were really looking for reveals itself. Because what you're really looking for is that you experience euphoria when you hit the summit of all those things, but it was fleeting. And by sitting in silence and being okay with what is, then your natural state is revealed. And guess what? It's euphoria, but it's much subtler, right? Because it's not based on an accomplishment. It's just based on who you really are.
I'm curious, Mark, personally speaking, because you've been at this for a while. Have there been weeks, months, years when you stopped meditating, when the thinker bubbled back up? Or does that happen regularly and you have to go deeper and try to get back into the witness? What does that process look like for you over the course of, decades?
That's a great question. There was some intermittent, especially when I got into SEALs. I was a dedicated everyday meditator for 4 years. Then I went in the SEALs, and it was a little bit harder because I didn't have control of my schedule. And so for the first, few months or year, maybe even first year, it was just focused on training. Now, I was fortunate in that there's a lot of training that the SEALs do that has benefits for introspection and meditation, situational awareness, concentration, attention control, the incredible focusing required of learning how to shoot and disassemble a weapon with your blindfold on. These are all really, Kim games, stuff like that. These are really good for training the mind in support of meditative practices. And so I don't think I lost any ground. And so during the SEALs, and I was able to kind of bring some of what I had learned under Nakamura's watchful eye into my SEAL life, because we had believe it or not, we were extraordinarily busy all the time. But in that business, there was a lot of downtime. We used to say, "Hurry up and wait," right? Imagine sitting on an op, waiting for an extraction platform to show up. It might be an hour, right? And so you're sitting in silence. And so an untrained mind sitting in silence is just bouncing around, thinking about this and that and the other thing. And so what I was doing was box breathing and, really kind of like just be really present, take things in, right? So I was doing practices, but I wasn't like sitting on a bench in the morning and the evening, like I do now. Now, when I left active duty, I got involved in my first entrepreneurial venture, Coronado Brewing Company, and there was alcohol involved because it was a brewery. And so while I was starting that, of course, once we got it up and running, we were drinking every day, my partners and I, and had to test the wares, of course.
Sure, of course.
And there was an inordinate amount of stress. Some of it self-induced from the pressure, but a lot of it induced by my relationship with my partners. And it all devolved into chaos and a lawsuit after 4 years because of certain circumstances, which I go into a little bit in my book, The Way of the SEAL, but and Staring on the Wolf. But it was unfortunate, but it was what it was. And man, that was probably the only time in my life where the energy was so overwhelmingly negative when I should have stopped everything and gone back to the meditation bench. And I didn't. And I could see in retrospect, that was one of the reasons that I got involved in that situation to begin with, because all the signs were there that I should never, and I was following my pattern of codependence and saying yes when part of me knew I should have said no. Right. And so after that experience, I saw that and I was like, okay, I really have to get back to the daily discipline practice. And by then I was kind of off active duty, but in the reserve. So had more control over my time. Yeah, I think there are times when, like you're traveling or you're on vacation, that it just seems impractical to practice. So I think it's important. I want to go back to that point about there's structured practice, and then there's practice that is, wherever you are, there you are type practices. And they tell that taking your practice off the bench or off the mat. And ultimately, practice becomes a moment-to-moment, right, thing. And that's the ultimate aim of mindfulness, right, is to develop the skill so that you take it with you and you're mindful all the time. It takes a while, but it's very doable, right? It's not, and it's weird because it's not something that you can actually, this is where it gets tricky. It's not something you can actually do. It's just something that evolves so that you are that, you are mindfully witnessing in the moment, during conversations, during, situations, even a crisis. And what the experience is things are happening over there, but I'm observing it over here. And first, the space is very, very narrow, but there is a definite experience, like a split second of I'm perceiving this happening, and my thinking mind is then gearing up to engage in what's happening. And in that space, of course, you have you can crack that open and widen it, right, with awareness, and you don't have to respond. And so you widen it by just saying, don't respond, pause, breathe, think, and then act. We actually use that acronym in the SEALs: pause, breathe, think, and then act. And what are you thinking? You're thinking, how am I going to respond instead of react to this? You can see how your conditioned mind gets triggered and wants to react, but you caught that snake at the head. And now you have the opportunity to think, how should I respond for a more appropriate outcome, more optimal outcome? In Unveiled Mind, we use a process we call WIRM, W-I-R-M. You witness, you intercept, that's catching the snake at the head. You intercept that pattern, that reactionary condition pattern, whether it's mental or emotional or even some sort of action. And you redirect. This is the thinking part. You redirect to something more appropriate and positive. That's going to be more productive. And a lot of times that's no action, right? And then you maintain your focus on that new path, because there's going to be a lot of energy trying to pull you back into the old, right? Because whatever that trigger was is still there. And that is, it's not mindfulness, but it's more of a mental control technique, a mental emotional control technique to take control of a situation so it doesn't torpedo you. And then mindfulness practice is developing the capacity to just be the observer, so that you're not just caught up in your thoughts and your story, riding it like a wild bull.
So one thing that I noticed throughout your books and throughout your work is that it's a bit more expansive than most people who come from the Western world, who tend to dismiss a lot of things as just woo or unbelievable or not part of their reality. What was it for you, or what is it for you that continues to, I guess, bring that expansiveness to your work and help lead other people in that direction? Because people who say that it's like closing your eyes and thinking that no one can see you. It's so short-sighted, right? But it's very difficult to kind of like bring people along for the ride to the other side of that. So how do you do that? And also, like, how can you be so unapologetic? That's one of the things I like about it. Is it's just like, this is my worldview. This is informed by a lot of experience, a lot of traveling, a lot of reading, a lot of time on the bench. How do you guide people in that other direction, or how do you stay so unapologetic about it?
Well, I have this saying, there's not one world out there, there's 8 billion worlds. When I wake up in the world wakes up to me. I don't wake up into a world, because I've learned through my training that we all create our own worlds. Now, there is a consensus reality, and that is generally what we call things, how we've named things. But most of that is virtual. Like the idea of a country, the idea of a state, the idea of money, the idea of the economy, how it's supposed to work. All of these things are just human concepts projected onto the world. They're not actually real. Same thing with your identity, what your thoughts about who you are, your name, your accomplishments, your cherished beliefs. All of that is virtual reality. It's not real. So my experience is that my world is very, very much my own. And so I don't have to apologize to anybody for it, nor will I. Now, because of that, every individual has to be a study of n equals 1, regardless of whether you believe Andrew Huberman's words or my words or Joe Rogan's words or Abel's words. You have to be a study of n equals 1. And if you're not doing things to test certain hypotheses, then you'll never see whether it's true or not, because of the observer principle, right? You're not going to see what you're not looking for. And the average human brain, which is the common brain, right, has the ability to see like 0.5% of the whole electromagnetic spectrum. And it's extremely narrow. And the conditioning of that body mind is going to narrow that even further, that perceptual range. And we know that the mind, the eyes in the mind perceive vastly more than your brain can construct as reality. And frankly, it fills in a lot of blanks for expediency. We know that from Daniel Kahneman's work, the System 1, System 2 mind. And so there's a lot of what people see, which are it's just mind-made fantasy. One of my teachers, a guy named Nisargadatta Maharaj, says that your world, the ego's projection, is a mind-generated fantasy. It's not real. And you get back what you put out, because the whole law of cause and effect, and energy and equals energy back, right? Every force has an equal opposite reaction. So you put a thought out there and you get exactly that back. As Jesus talked about this in the Course in Miracles, and the whole Course in Miracles is to teach you to put forgiveness out and love out. If you really want forgiveness and love, you project it first. So at any rate, as I mentioned, I'm very grateful to have been introduced to Zen and the martial arts when I was in my 20s, because first of all, I saw things which I had never seen before, which didn't seem humanly possible. Right? I saw my Mr. Nakamura like split these 4 massive blocks of ice, each one of them like 8 to 10 inches thick, with his forehead, and smile and walk away. Right? You and I would have probably be dead if we smacked that kind of hard object for their forehead. How did he do that? Right? Energy. Right? His teacher Masayama was famed for cutting the horn off of a charging bull with his right hand. These are called siddhis, or special powers that it can accrue from like long periods of focused training. You see this in the martial arts movies, and people who are Western-minded trained and have that limited, they just think it's fantasy. And there's a fair amount of fantasy there, but there's also seeds of reality. I studied Aikido for many years, and Ueshiba, the founder of Aikido, in his later years, people, knew that he had some special powers, and, he didn't love kind of displaying them, but one of the things he did do is allow people to try to shoot him, like with a gun. And so several examples of this, where he had 3 people lined up, like 25 or 15 yards away, and he's like sitting down, either cross-legged or on a bench, and he gives them the signal that it's okay to pull the trigger, and the rounds go off, and he's behind them, disarming them. Amazing. I saw a video of about 20 black belts piled on top of a Ueshiba, like a big, massive pig pile. And you're just watching, and then you just start to see some movement, and suddenly the whole pile starts moving like this, and guys just start flying off, and he just stands up. Like, what? Okay, so that led me to say, well, something's, and another example, back to Nakamura, like, it's not just some sort of physical act of like holy shitness, just the way he was, like the level of compassion that this man had. Like, this guy, man, he was a badass guy. You did not want to fight him. But he just had this massive love for everybody, massive compassion, and this lightness of spirit, spontaneous laughter, like super present and generous with his time. He was different than any American, any Westerner I had ever seen. That's a special power, right? So I had these great examples early on, and I was like, that's cool. And then, of course, in the SEALs, I experienced things that were just like, what the bleep? I had an experience where I was walking to the range one day. It was a training. We're doing our refresher training with the weapons. So I was 25 yards, and it's cold in the morning. It's up Camp Pendleton. And I'm the first group of like 3 or 4 to start off the firing. And as I'm walking there, I felt a hand on my shoulder, and I felt more than heard this whisper just say, "Stop." And of course, I'd been meditating now for 5 years, and I was really kind of pretty aware. So that was unusual. So I stopped. And as soon as I did that, a friend of mine had an accidental discharge back at the camp, and the bullet went. I could feel the wind on my right ear. Right. I had other experiences, several like that, where I had a parachuting accident where I was plummeting. My chute, I had a midair collision. My main chute collapsed at about 1,000 feet, and I'm just falling fast. And I'm going through my procedures, shaking the risers, and I'm breathing. And then as I'm going through this, like, time completely slows down, and everything gets really thick. Like I'm just like falling through soup, or through thick air. And I'm just breathing, going through everything's clear to me, exactly what I need to do. I pull my reserve, I punch it, I throw my reserve out, I go back and shake the risers, I shake the reserves, I'm breathing, I'm calm, no fear. And finally, one last time, I shake the main, and it opens, and I hit the ground. And it opened just enough to give me a survivable landing. No bones, nothing happened to me. And that experience was like, okay, wow, it's either, some protective hand, or, what was that? And then I got into, so back in, when I got off active duty, I told you about the brewing company experience. And after the experience, I was like, I had this urge to get back into a martial art, because I wasn't able to study while I was active SEAL. So I found something called ninjutsu, but then I also found yoga, because I stumbled upon Paramahansa Yogananda's book, Autobiography of a Yogi, which is a fantastic read. Introduced me to the whole world of the yoga tradition, the full-on yoga, not stretchy bendy yoga, but like the science of mental development, science of reunification. And Yogananda in his book, and I actually lived literally a few hundred yards from the Self-Realization Fellowship that he started here in Encinitas. So his energy pervades this town. Like, he was incredible. And one of his kind of things that he needed to do, he knew at a very young age, was to come to America to bring yoga, traditional yoga, to America, meaning the science of self-realization. That's why he called his group the Self-Realization Fellowship. And also to write this book. He wrote a number of books, but the Autobiography of a Yogi was the book that was really his contribution to help Americans or Westerners kind of like appreciate what yoga really is. And so he has many stories of his teachers and his teachers' teachers. And some of the things that he talked about, most people just wouldn't believe. I think it's just, the guy's just telling fantasy stories. But because of my experience with martial arts and some of the experience I talked about and others, like, I didn't question him at all. I was like, this is absolute truth. Right. And then I went down that rabbit hole, and I was exposed to tons and tons of both kind of ancient as well as modern texts about the yoga tradition. And then in the Qigong tradition, where you have discussions about people living for 1,000 years or hundreds of years. And you have people who like transform their bodies, like Swami Rama in his book, The Master of the Himalayas, talks about this master he finally found who was able to demonstrate his power. And the guy literally just disappeared into a bowl. The bowl got heavier, and then he reappeared. And again, most people, when they hear this stuff, this says, no fucking way. But everything is energy, and the mind controls that energy. And so yoga is a science of the mind, and these people have spent many, many years developing their minds to be able to control their energy, the energy of their body. And so I am very, very motivated by that. And that's why I train every day. I train yoga every day. I meditate, visualize every day. I don't expect, or, some could say I already have special cities, because the way I can train and I have an awareness, like that whole bullet exercise, that I just seem to sense danger and all that. But I just think that's intuition. And I'm not looking to have a special city where I live to 1,000, but I would like to live for as long as I need to fulfill my mission. In order to do that, I'm going to be radically healthy and develop longevity. And I expect, or my orientation toward longevity is it's a mental thing, right? I'm not needing to do 71, supplements and drugs every day. And right. It's a mental thing. I first know that I can have a body of a 35, 40-year-old. And I visualize that every day. I call it in. So that's kind of like the yogi's path, right? Starts with the mind. The mind generates the body. I don't know if I'm answering your question very well, but I'm unapologetic about it because of my life experiences and the trust I have in some of these masters. Like I've been involved in the Eastern martial arts and yoga now for so many years that I just don't question it or doubt it. I've seen yogis who are in their 90s and hundreds who look like you and I. And so I'm like, okay, evidence. And there's, again, some terrific reading. Like there's this book called The Holographic Universe. Some of the things that this guy, I forget the guy, his name, who wrote it, but he passed away literally a year after he wrote it. Some of the things he describes in the book are just mind-boggling, right? Like real accounts. The story of this Russian guy who could like run a sword through his body and pull it out and he was fine. And there was just a red mark. They even took and had it x-rayed. And the x-ray showed the sword run through the body and he pulls it out and he was fine, all healed up. What is going on here, Abel, right? So I'm serious. Like this world, if you believe it to be contracted and solely objective material, you're missing the boat. Because it's not. It is a mind-generated fantasy, right? So first job, if you want to live a healthy, positive and productive and incredible life, take charge of the fantasy and begin to create a different reality for yourself. And let's co-create a different reality for this world. Because what we call humanity is barreling toward freaking crevasse, So I think that's my mission. That's your mission. Let's put positive energy. Let's show people a path to break free from that. Ultimate freedom from all types of control. Corporate control over what we eat, medical system control over what we put in our bodies, government control over everything, every aspect of our lives. It's all an old, broken, decaying system that is like grasping, right? Now it's grasping for control of the entire planet. And we don't have to buy into that. And the more people who just turn their backs on that, don't fight it. I mean, you fight it if someone comes to try to take you, right? Or to shove a needle in your arm. I'd be fighting that, right? I'm not saying don't be a doormat, but I'm saying energetically don't fight it because that's what they want. Just turn your back on it and let's build a completely different world. And we can do that at scale now with conversations like this.
I love it, Mark. Not only did you answer that question, but you also covered about a half dozen other things that I really wanted to talk about during this interview. So awesome. That's a testament to your intuition or whatever the heck else is going on. So thank you for that. And we're just about out of time. But Mark, what is the best way for people to find your all of your books, your work, Uncommon, your new book, as well as whatever you're up to next?
Man, you're so generous, Abel. The book, it's read on the pre-order. I don't know what time this will be launched, but it comes out on Tuesday, the 16th. So this will probably go out after that. But if you want to take advantage of that pre-order stuff, it'll still be there. It's at readuncommon.com. But the book will be available, obviously, on Amazon everywhere. My personal website, where my other books and speaking stuff, is markdevine.com. And the training, the path that I talk about in Uncommon, we call the training Unbeatable Mind, and we have a training resources at unbeatablemind.com. great place to start is our 30-day challenge, where we introduce our breathing techniques and our focusing techniques and, our movement techniques, and kind of like start to draw you into that path. That's probably enough. But thanks. Also, the Mark Divine Show. That's a good one.
Yes. Highly recommended. Awesome. Well, Mark, once more, thank you so much for joining us on this show. I look forward to the next time. And man, keep getting after it. We need so many more people talking like you do and walking like you do through this world, and really appreciate you. So thanks so much for spending time with us today.
Yeah, thank you, Abel. I appreciate you, brother. Hoo-yah.
Hey, Abel here one more time. And if you believe in our mission to create a world where health is the norm, not sickness, here are a few things you can do to help keep this show coming your way. Click like, subscribe, and leave a quick review wherever you listen to or watch your podcasts. You can also subscribe to my new Substack channel for an ad-free version of this show in video and audio. That's at abeljames.substack.com. You can also find me on Twitter or X, YouTube, as well as Fountain FM, where you can leave a little crypto in the tip jar. And if you can think of someone you care about who might learn from or enjoy this show, please take a quick moment to share it with them. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.